Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, and thank you for joining today's webinar, PowerPivot and PowerView, Business Intelligence Tools for Smart Strategies. I'm Megan Turco, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we jump in, I'm going to briefly go over how to use your webinar console. The orange arrow on the right side of your screen will let you toggle the control tray open or closed, and at the bottom of the control tray, you'll see a chat window. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar via the chat function, and we will get to those towards the end of the webinar. Additionally, on your GoToWebinar console, you should see an area for audio settings. If you're calling in through your telephone, please choose the Use Telephone option. And alternatively, if you're using your computer speakers, please select the Use Mic and Speakers option. I do want to note that today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll send out the slides as well as an on-demand recording of the webinar within about 48 hours, so definitely keep an eye out for that message if you're interested in accessing the webinar after today or sharing it with any colleagues who couldn't make it with us live today. And with that, I would like to introduce today's webinar speaker. We have Noah Kalugi with us today, who is a senior manager with Armanino's Business Intelligence practice. During his career, Noah has been responsible for the design, build, and implementation of numerous BI projects. And with a background in Armanino's North America segment of Precision Point, Noah has seen the firsthand value of data warehouses and the benefit of their seamless integrations through dynamic insights. And with that, Noah, I'm going to go ahead and pass the presentation over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Megan. As Megan mentioned, my name is Noah Kluge, and my background is from an academic standpoint is finance, and I've kind of always been involved in Excel-related automation work in addition to the data warehousing functionality and function that Megan had talked about. And so today, I think that what we'll really talk about is really almost more in that Excel area of kind of my interest, if you will. So what we'll talk about is Microsoft Excel Power Query, PowerPivot, and PowerView. These are distinct technologies that are all part of the Microsoft Office environment. And we'll go through a little bit of nuance for you to be aware of around licensing requirements, different versions of PowerPivot that are out there and implications of those. And then we'll go through a demo of using PowerPivot and PowerView with a Dynamics ERP data source, as well as using a data warehouse. So we'll go through all of that today, and then maybe just a little dabbling into Power BI, at least as far as the concept is concerned. So that's the goal for today. So with that, here are the three different topics that I just mentioned. So Power Query, PowerPivot, PowerView, and a little bit of information about each one of those here. So the Power Query can be used for SQL data sources. It can be used for unstructured data, you know, like stock information, things like that. And I would say that Power Query is really best focused on that more unstructured data, at least in the context of where I feel like these tools can fit in when it comes to an information worker's role within a company. PowerPivot can do a lot of the same types of functionality around unstructured data and so on, but I think it's best served to focus on structured data, so like SQL database tables, you know, maybe Oracle database tables, as well as Excel Excel files. But they typically do follow a structure, if you will. And then PowerView is all about visualization that sits on top of PowerPivot. When it comes to versions of Excel, the key theme here is that you do need to be on the Professional Plus version of each one of these, unless you bought Excel as a standalone, which isn't very common. At least I haven't seen it very often. So again, you do need to be on the Professional Plus version of Excel. And that applies for 2010, 2013, and then Office 365. The one thing to be aware of, though, is that PowerView, if you're on Excel 2010, and I know that there's a few companies still out there that are, you cannot use PowerView with Excel 2010. You do need to be on Excel 2013 or Office 365 to use PowerView. And in all these cases, really, it's talking about it as an on-premise type of installation. And so if you want to do an IT, kind of enterprise type implementation of PowerPivot and PowerView, you would use SharePoint to do that, and that would be part of an on-premise strategy. And if you're doing that, you can use SharePoint 2010 and forward, but you do need to be on the enterprise version. So if you have SharePoint standard, the components that you need to support PowerPivot, which would be like Excel services, that is not included in SharePoint standard. Again, you do need to be on SharePoint Enterprise. So that's a little bit about kind of what the different products are broadly speaking, and then a little bit of nuance around what's available when, because it can trip people up from time to time. So the first part is, what is Power Query? Well, as I mentioned, Power Query is a way to bring data from different sources together. So you can bring together data that's from an Excel spreadsheet, maybe from a website. You can bring it together into a single source. And the kind of the best example of that, I guess, would be taking data that might be for, say, stock information. So with what's going on in the market today, there might be a fair amount of interest in stock analysis. And so what you could do is you could take a dump of data from the NYSE, dump of data from NASDAQ, and then using Power Query, you could pull like columns from each of those sources, map it together into a single source that would then be fed into PowerPivot or PowerView for analysis within your Excel environment. So that's an example of where Power Query is really is best suited, in my opinion. You can do, again, you can pull from SQL data sources, things of that nature, but if you're going to use it in PowerPivot, typically speaking, what you would want to do within Power Query, you can also do in PowerPivot, so you may as well just do it all in one tool, which would be PowerPivot. And along those lines, it's not what I'll refer to as an ETL tool, and to define that, that is extract, transform, and load. So within the Microsoft stack, there is what's called integration services. It's a component of SQL Server, and that is a true ETL tool. It's intended to take data from disparate data sources, bring it together, and apply complex transformations to it. That's not something that Power Query is intended to do. It's more, Power Query is very much more of an end-user type of tool. And then when it does come, as I mentioned, when it does come to SQL data sources, there are some things you can do in Power Query you cannot do within PowerPivot, but generally speaking, most things you can do within PowerPivot. So if it's just for your own personal BI needs, your ad hoc analysis needs, I'd probably just recommend just staying within PowerPivot. So what is PowerPivot? Well, first, it is an in-memory technology that takes data from the sources that you're collecting it from. So again, that could be a SQL database, it could be another Excel file, it could be other sources, and it allows for you to take that data, bring it into your Excel workbook. Once it's in that workbook, it's not stored within a worksheet or a separate tab within your workbook as normal data is, but instead it's actually stored kind of within the file memory itself. And so when you're interacting with it, it's going to bring it up into RAM or into memory on the computer you're running it on. And this is really Microsoft's first kind of entry into what's referred to as in-memory. When there's other products out there that are in-memory type technologies, like ClickView, for instance, is another example, which has been around for about 20 years now. But so Microsoft is entering into that space, and they're continuing to to enter into it more. But PowerPivot is the first kind of entry into that. And as I mentioned, you can bring data from different sources together in this environment. And PowerPivot, because it is an Excel-based tool, it's typically used primarily by power users. So maybe somebody in finance who needs to do a key analysis, or somebody in sales and marketing. It can also be used within IT to do a proof of concept. So one thing that's neat about PowerPivot is that it'll actually build a model behind it, and you can take that model and you can export it into SQL Server to be the starting point for a particular kind of cube infrastructure, which if there's questions at the end, feel free to ask, but I'll leave it at that for now. Within PowerPivot, it does use a different language to interact with the data. So if you want to write calculations, you use a language that's called data analysis expressions, or more commonly known as DAX. And this is a different way to write calculations. So it's not the same as like an Excel formula, just something to be aware of because it is an Excel-based tool. And when it comes to doing an enterprise rollout, you can integrate with SharePoint Enterprise, as I mentioned, with Excel services. So this would be a way to write a dashboard or a table within Excel, and then you can publish it up to SharePoint where it can be consumed by others. So that's how these different pieces of technology can start to work together. If you are running Office 2010 or Excel 2010, just one thing to kind of be aware of, and I wanted to go through this because lots of different companies are going to be on the call, and people are in different phases of their implementation of technology, within their own companies. But with PowerPivot, there's actually a couple of different versions of it. Originally, it was part of SQL Server, and it was originally released with SQL 2008 R2. You're probably wondering why you should care. And the reason is because Excel 2010, if you have that 2008 R2 version of PowerPivot, it uses a different data model than what's used in the more recent version with Excel 2010, which was actually released with SQL 2012. So what that means is that if Joe is running Excel with the old version of PowerPivot, and then he sends it off to Sally. Sally makes a change. It's going to update it to now be in the new data model, and then Joe will not be able to open up that new report, even though they both have Excel 2010, even though they both looked at it, that report. When he gets it back, he will not be able to look at it or he will not be able to interact with it because it's going to be with that now converted to that new model. So it's something to be aware of. And if you are on Excel 2010 within your company and nobody's really using PowerPivot today, I would definitely recommend that you move up to the 2012 version of it versus the original version. There's some pretty key things that were fixed with the 2012 version. And if you're wondering what version you've got, the way that you find out is not the traditional way within Excel where you go look at COM add-ins, but instead what you have to do is go to your installed programs, and then you can see the screenshots below. So you see Microsoft SQL Server PowerPivot for Excel in the top screenshot, and then the 2012 is the second screenshot. By the way, both of these are 32-bit versions, and that's the default installation with Excel. So most people, if you're using Excel, you're probably using the Excel 32-bit version. In general, there's no reason to install the 64-bit version. It can cause issues with other add-ins and things like that. But if you do plan to do a lot of work with PowerPivot, because of the memory, the high intensity nature on memory that PowerPivot can have, that could be a reason to actually install the 64-bit version of Excel. But definitely research the add-ins that you use before you go down that path. Okay. So with PowerPivot, I guess just want to share some benefits and maybe some considerations that you need to think about when you're using PowerPivot or you're looking to see if it's going to be the right tool. So first is it is a quick and easy way to get information out. And just like pivot tables are kind of a go-to for most people within finance or that sales or marketing function. If you need to do that ad hoc analysis, PowerPivot is really a continuation of that, but it allows for you to work with bigger data sets and do kind of more powerful things behind the scenes. It's also going to be in an interface that you're familiar with today. So it's going to be in Excel. If you're an Excel Power user, you probably will be able to figure it out pretty easily. And then if you're on the right version of Excel, it's free to you to start using. So there's a website you can go out to download PowerPivot and then install it in your computer or on your client, and then you're ready to go. So with that though, you do need to recognize that you do need to understand the underlying data model, so you understand how the different tables that you're going to connect together, how they relate, and so you have to have that working knowledge of the underlying database. And for those of you that are on a Microsoft Dynamics ERP system, or if you're on another ERP system that has what I'll refer to as multiple companies, which affects how the data is stored within the system, really requiring you to have two columns and a join. PowerPivot doesn't handle that very well out of the box, or at all out of the box, and you need to think about how you're going to handle it. That's normally where like a data warehouse type of infrastructure comes into play to resolve that. And then I mentioned the DAX language, so you do need to be aware that there's a new calculation language if you want to do work within PowerPivot itself to do changes to the data and things like that. And yeah, so I'll go ahead and keep moving here. So as far as what it's not, I certainly would say it's not a replacement for a data warehouse, and this really comes down to the next point, which is around the extract, transform, and load capabilities that it has. So it has basic functionality in that respect, but if you need to take data from 3 different tables, bring it together, apply business rules that if this is true, then do this. If another scenario is true, then do something else. If you need to do that kind of logic, then PowerPivot really isn't the right tool. Again, you should probably look at SQL Integration Services or another ETL tool to be able to handle that. Another area is that kind of a common scenario that people run into is that they have sales invoice line detail, but in order to be able to make sense of that data, they need to connect it to the header information for those sales invoice lines, and then they need to connect it out to other reference tables. So maybe it's the customer record, the item card, things like that. And when you start connecting more than 2 tables together, you run into limitations within PowerPivot. So that's something else to be aware of. And kind of, I guess the last 2 bullets, there's 2 things that are really, or there's really kind of one key thing there, and it's around security and data governance. So when you have PowerPivot, because it is really an end-user type of tool, the data that's been brought into Excel is really in Excel. It's not that the data is sitting on a governed IT server somewhere. It's in your Excel workbook. So if you connect to a customer table that has a social security number, date of birth, or credit card information, things like that, then that data is going to be in your Excel spreadsheet. And if somebody is familiar with PowerPivot, then they're going to be able to get into it. So definitely consider the implications around security before you start to go into this. And the other kind of common, when it comes to like say BI type reporting, a common thing is that you want to have one view. Maybe it's for departmental operating expenses or sales by territory. You have a standard template, and then depending upon the person, you pass their user ID, and then it will return the results that they're allowed to see. You don't really have a way to do that in this pure Excel model because all that data is in Excel. You can get around that though if you go down the SharePoint Enterprise route. Okay, so PowerView is all about data visualization, and this comes into play with Excel 2013 Professional. And if you do want to go down and implement this in SharePoint Server Enterprise, you do need to have this one add-in involved. But this is a way, PowerView is all about making what you've got within PowerPivot easier to use. You can still use standard Microsoft charts and things like that with PowerPivot data, but the PowerView kind of extends that and lets you do some more stuff that you can't do just with a standard chart. Okay, all right, so let's go through an example. We'll go through 2. The first one will be using PowerPivot with Microsoft Dynamics dataset, and then the second one will be using PowerPivot and PowerView with the data warehouse solution. So just to kind of show you different ways to get into the data. Okay, with any luck, you should be able to see a blank Excel screen here. So just to double check that. All right, that's what it looks like. Okay, good. So I've got a couple of different add-ins in this environment. The ones that I want to call out specifically right now are Power Query and Power Pivot, and then I'm going to go into Power Pivot now. So I'm just in Excel. This is 2013, and I'm going to, on the Power Pivot tab, I'm going to go to Manage. So this is to create the data model. Okay. All right, so now I'm in the Power Pivot window. You can see the different connections I can make, so to Azure Marketplace, to OData, data that may be out there, to SQL Server database, to an Access database, other things like that. I'm going to connect to SQL Server, and then I'm going to put in the name of the server because it's local. That's the name of it, and then I'll choose my data source. So this is again going to go straight against an ERP system, to a Microsoft Dynamics ERP system. Okay, so now I can either write a query to tell it what tables or what fields to bring together. This is an area where maybe, you know, if I'm familiar with writing SQL, I could do joins within here. That's one way to get around the limitation I mentioned with PowerPivot. So you could do joins within, you know, your query at this point. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select from a list, and this will return all the different tables that are out there. And so what we're going to work on today is an example using sales invoices, and the table is called Cust Invoice Trans, and all right, there it is. Okay, so now I've got, that's my transaction table. I'll tell them, they'll say what was purchased on what invoice, the date information, things like that. And for sake of an example, I'm going to bring in one dimension table. But if I was, you know, really building this out, I'd probably want to attach in multiple dimension tables, say maybe, you know, customer information, salesperson information, things like that. In this case, I'm just going to bring in one for the item. And there it is. Okay, so there I've got my tables, and I'm going to go ahead and click Finish. And so what it's going to do is it's going to extract the data from those tables, bring it into the PowerPivot environment, and you can see that it inserted in 4,500 rows from the custom invoice trans and 299 rows from this table, from the reference table. So that's the data I was expecting, and I'm going to go ahead and click Close. And what you'll notice is that it's provided me a sample of the data up here, and then you can see the two different tabs that are down here. So when it comes to using this within Excel, within a pivot table, I need to create a relationship in between these two different sources. So here's my column. As I mentioned, I brought in the item table, and I want to create a relationship in between the custom invoice trans and the invent table. So I'm going to create a relationship. Because of the tab I'm on and the column I had selected, it pre-selected this information, and then I'm going to select the other table. So had I had, you know, a customer table, a vendor table, salesperson table, I would have had multiple lookup tables to choose from, but I only had this one. So it went out and it said, okay, well, this is a column from the transaction table. What's a potential name for the other one? And so it pre-populated with item ID here. I'm going to click Create. Okay, so it gives me an error message, and I wanted to go through this because if you're dabbling with this, you may very well run into this as well. What this error means is that there's duplicate values in the reference table for item ID. So here I've got the invent table with item ID, and you notice that I cannot add other columns to join on, meaning it cannot be a compound or a composite key. It can only be joined on one column. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my invent table, and I'm going to make that unique. How I'm going to do that is to filter out what I know is causing there to be duplicates, which is the data area ID. And what I'm going to do actually is that if I go in and I just change this to only be one company, it'll still give me an error because that filter is actually just being applied on this data set that I'm looking at. If I want it to be applied on the data as it comes in, I need to go into the Design tab, go to Table Properties, and then apply my filter here. Okay, so I'm going to filter down to only one company. So the CEU company. Okay, so now I'm filtered down to that. Click Save. It's going to rerun that query, and it's going to, at this point, it's going to submit another query to the SQL Server data source, and it's only going to be looking at that one data area ID. So the data is being filtered before it gets into PowerPivot. Okay, so now I'm back to here. I'm back on the Custom Invoice Trans tab, and then I'm going to go in here and set this up one more time. Okay, so now I'm connected to that. I click Create. It looks like it's taking a little bit more time, and it seemed to be happy about that. I can tell that there's a connection in between the two because it added this little icon up here, so it tells you that it has a relationship to that other table. So within here, now I've got my data from my transaction system. I've got my reference data that aligns with it, at least for this purpose. Now I'm going to create a pivot table within Excel. And I'm going to show a different kind of pivot table that I think is kind of cool that you can use with PowerPivot. It's called the flattened pivot table. So I'm going to choose that, and I'm going to do it as a new worksheet. Okay. So now I've got a pivot table with a new worksheet added, connected to that source. And I know it's connected because it shows a custom invoice trans and the related reference table that's in this data model. So now I can start bringing things in for analysis. What I'm going to do first, though, is just show you how you can use like a slicer, which is kind of handy. So I'm going to go over here to the Insert tab and then go to Slicer on Filter here. Go to All, because I don't have a slicer now. That's why Active was empty. Okay, and then I'm going to add on the delivery country region. Okay. And so now I've got a filter that's going to bring it down to a particular set of company codes, or country codes rather. Okay, so from here what I'll do is I'll bring on different fields. So maybe I want to bring on the invoice date, I want to bring on the invoice ID. Maybe now what I want is information about the item, so maybe the item group, the item ID itself. Okay, so now that's been added on. And then I'll go back and I'll add a quantity. So we're looking at sales invoice details. So we probably want to see a quantity that was sold, as well as we'll want to see a line amount. So we'll bring that on. Okay, so now I've got a sum of quantity, sum of line amount by each day. I can see the invoice ID. I can see here I've got a total. So on this particular invoice, I've got 20 items. So there's 8, actually it's, that's not going to be correct because of these totals. So let me go ahead and get rid of these. But one way that I like to set these up is to avoid the subtotals so they're not there, and it just makes it a pure listing. But now you'll see if I sum these up, I get 20 down here, which is the same as what's here. So as you'd expect, it ties out. Okay, and so now I've got the invoice date, the invoice ID, the item group, item ID, the quantity, the line amount information. So it's just a listing based on the data that I had within the PowerPivot environment. And I could take this and choose, say, a different company, so now, or a different country rather. So now this is only for Canada, and maybe I want to get rid of these subtotals as well. So it's all data for Canada, all data for US, and so on. One thing that's really nice about these these slicers, if you haven't played with them, and this is above and beyond putting it over here, you can take a slicer and you can actually have it pointed to multiple pivot tables. So you can use this to build out a dashboard just using standard pivot tables and pivot charts, produce a dashboard, and then you can have these slicers that will affect those different objects within that particular report. So that's a quick run through with a data or a ERP system as a data source. So things to just kind of watch out for will be around the need to apply transformations, the need to join multiple tables together to be able to provide this kind of view or the data source that you want. So before you get too far into PowerPivot, you'll probably need to resolve those kinds of issues, either with the data warehouse or with views or something like that, if that's an issue that you think you're going to have. So let me go ahead and go over to a new tab here, okay, or a new workbook to use proper Excel language. So I'm now in a new workbook, and I'm going to go back to PowerPivot, and I'm going to connect to a different source. So I'm back in on the PowerPivot ribbon, going to Manage here, and I'm going to choose a SQL Server data source, and it's going to be on the same local server, but it's going to have a different name. So I'm going to pull in the data from the data warehouse, and the reason that the data warehouse is helpful is that it's going to take the primary fact table. So how you store data within a data warehouse is different than how you store it within the transaction system. A data warehouse is typically built around fact tables, and those fact tables will take data, eliminate the need for intense joins to occur, and it makes it faster for report UIs to run and things of that nature. And so in this case, what I've got is this one table that I'm going to connect to, and it has a lot of data in it. So I'm going to apply a filter to it. So I'm going to filter on my customers in this list here. So it's only going to be for customer. And then I'm going to do another sales kind of example. And so I'm going to filter down to only revenue accounts. So I'm not bringing in, say, cost of goods sold and stuff like that. Okay. And so I'm going to only choose my revenue. Okay, so now it's just revenue. And then the last thing I'm going to do is that this table, because I'm familiar with the data, I know that it also will include orders, and I want to filter out orders, and I think I went past it. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, so I wanted to filter down to only actual here. So I'm going to choose only actual. Okay, so now I've got my data with the filters applied, and the filters will be applied on the data before it comes into PowerPivot, so it should be pretty quick here. Okay, so I got 5,800 rows of data that's been brought into the memory of this workbook. So I'm going to click Close here. Okay, so you can see the data that's here. Just like when we saw against the ERP data source, it created a tab. In this case, there's just one source, so I have the financials tab here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Excel and go to the Insert tab and go to PowerView. And this will allow for me to create a PowerView tab within Excel. Okay, so now we talked about how you can use PowerPivot and then just normal charts on top of it within Excel. Now this is using PowerView, which is a little bit different, and it has a more polished kind of look and feel to it compared to standard charts. But let's see, so let me just go ahead and start with this. So I'm going to bring on the amount. Okay, so now I've got the amount on here, and I'm going to make this into a chart ultimately, so I'm going to change that to a column chart. Okay, so now it's a chart. And then I need to bring on a dimension to describe that, so I'm going to bring on month number, which will be the month that the revenue is from. So I'm going to bring that to the axis. Okay, so now I've got months across the top here for the amount. And now what I'm going to do is add a slicer to this. So let me go ahead and, so you have that same concept of a slicer, but I'm going to add the item class here as my slicer. And on the design tab, because I'm in PowerView here, I'm going to choose slicer, and that's going to change this into a slicer now. So if I change this and I choose different values, you'll notice that my chart is updated. Okay. So I remove my filter. I'll just go ahead and move that over here. Okay, And now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring on the amount, and I'm going to put together a little chart that has by country on it. So now I've got the dollar amount here, and I will just take my country code, okay, bring that down. And okay, so you'll notice that I've got my amount first and then country. I want to change that around so country is first, so I'll just change that down here in the field section. Okay, so now that's been updated. So now I've got that information on here. And now what I want to do is I want to look at the customers themselves, so by posting group at least. So this is going to be kind of summary information. So I'm going to create another chart. I'm going to drop amount on here again, make this a pie chart. Okay, so now I've got my pie. I need to add a dimension to get the lines in there, so to slice it up, if you will. And for that, I'm going to use the posting group. Okay. All right, so now I can see I've got trended by month. I've got the customer posting groups, country information. I can choose an item class. Last thing I want to do to get this data right, because it's actually summing this up across time periods here, I'm going to add another slicer for transaction date. And this is something that you may definitely run into. So what you'll notice is that it's summing the transaction date, and I don't want it to do that. What I want it to do is to just leave it alone, so it lists them out. So I'm going to change this to do not summarize in the field section. So now it's set up like that, and then I'm going to make it a slicer just like we saw before. So now I've got the ability to change my time, and you can see the data is being updated. And then if I wanted to look at, say, only major customers, I can do that. So now I can see this is only for major customers, or maybe I want to see a view for only October of 2008. I changed that, and now I can see with my chart that it's 1.2 million is what major customers bought in October, and then that's out of a total of 4.3 million across all of time. So you can start to see how you can build pretty quick and easy dashboards within this environment. Looking at time here, the last thing I guess just to show is I can just do one more quick example with PowerView. Okay, so I'm going to insert a new tab here, and then just go through a quick example of something that they've added within PowerView. I'm going to add amount to this new tab, and then I'm going to add gross profit. Okay, so I've added gross profit, and then I'm going to add item class again. And then this will be a way to analyze this over time. And I'm going to convert this now into a scatter chart. That's on the design tab, or the design ribbon. Under other charts, I'll choose scatter. Okay, so now I've got a chart here. And then I can add another one for quantity, and then I'll explain what we're looking at. Okay, so the y-axis is gross profit. The X is amount, and then size is quantity. So the bigger it is, the more of it that was sold. And essentially what you'd want is everything to be over here, or at the very least you want it to be in the top here, because this is going to be gross profit. So if you want to see this over time, what I can do is that I can add transaction date quarter to this as the play axis, it's called. And then actually I'm also, and you can also add slicers to it. So I'm going to add a slicer here for calendar year, maybe. Okay. Don't summarize, okay. And then I'll convert to a slicer. Okay, so now I can choose a different time period, and then you can see how it's updating the chart. So now I've got that on there, and then if I want to see how this changes throughout a time period, I can click the transaction date play button here, and you can see it's changing. You can watch this right here, and you can see how it's changing over time. So it's a quick example of different capabilities that are brought in within within PowerView. So we saw how you could create just a listing within PowerPivot, and then we went through an example of creating a dashboard with several different objects within PowerView, and then we went through that example using using time here as well. So if you want to store this on your own local machine, you can certainly do that because it's just an Excel file. What I'm going to do is I'll save it as local here, and I'm going to overwrite this example file that I've got. So I'm going to save it. Okay. So now I've got a saved copy, and then also if I wanted to deploy this to say SharePoint, I could do file and then send to the SharePoint site, and then it's going to automatically recognize it and bring it up in Excel services if that's what I want. The other thing that you can do is that this is Power BI, and then I can share it with, or I can look at it through the website. So if you've seen PowerBI.com, this is a topic really that we'll go through in another webinar. But for today, just to show how it fits in with the PowerPivot and PowerView, is that I can import a file. And I'm going to choose a local file, and then I'll choose this one here. And so now what it's doing is it's uploading my file from my computer up to the Microsoft Cloud, and now I can see that it added a new data set and then a new PowerView example. So if I open up, okay, so I can go here and open it up. And then, as you'll notice, it looks a lot like what we started with. So they've done a pretty good job of setting it up so you can take what's in your Excel on your local and then load it up to PowerBI.com, and so you can see I choose the different values, and then it updates my charts and the other information's out there. So that's a quick demo, and to go back through to wrap up here, let me flip back to the slides. Okay, so I did briefly touch on Power BI. I showed how you can take a PowerPivot and PowerView based reports. You can save those out to the PowerBI.com website. It is a cloud-based subscription, so there's a free version. There's also a pay-for version that, as you would expect, lets you do more stuff. And you can use it to distribute reports that are built using PowerPivot or PowerView, as well as you can use reports that are built using Power BI Desktop, and you can distribute those through the and interact with them through the PowerBI.com website. And Power BI itself is certainly more than I can cover in in the next 2 minutes. So that will be a webinar, a future webinar of its own. And so in conclusion, to summarize, I guess, we went through examples of what Power Query, or we went through what Power Query, PowerPivot, and PowerView are, went through a demo of each one of those, and then discussed considerations you may have around licensing, so different versions of Excel, what versions of PowerPivot are out there, and implications of those. So that's what we had planned for today's webinar. And with that, I guess I'll pass it over to you, Megan, to see if there's any questions.
Thanks, Noah. Actually, it looks like we are just about out of time for today's webinar, but if anyone does have any additional questions after the webinar, just in a moment here, we will put up Noah's contact information, so you're welcome to contact him directly. So we'll go ahead and actually switch to that next slide so that we can show them their
Sure.
information there. And we do also have John Horner's contact information on there. Noah is great about responding, but just in case you want to reach out to both of them, John is the partner in charge of our business intelligence practice here at Armanino. And as a reminder, we will be sending out both the slides as well as the on-demand recording of today's webinar, so no need to worry about copying these down right now, right away. As you exit today's webinar, there will be a quick survey. Please definitely take a moment to let us know your thoughts on today's webinar. We'd like to make sure that we continue bringing you some great content in these webinars. And thank you so much to Noah for those great demos and all of the wonderful content that you shared today. And thank you, of course, to our audience for joining us.